The steel monsters emerged from the morning fog like prehistoric beasts, their engines rumbling across the frozen steppe. Inside each turret sat men who understood that hesitation meant death, that the first shot often decided who would return to their lines and who would burn. The German Panzerwaffe produced tank commanders whose kill counts defied belief, men who turned armored warfare into a form of industrial slaughter. This was not heroism in any traditional sense. This was survival elevated to an art form, brutality refined through repetition, and an intimate understanding that modern war had become a contest of machines guided by men willing to kill without pause. The Eastern Front created these killers. The vast distances, the endless columns of Soviet armor, the desperate nature of a war that Germany could not afford to lose, all of it forged tank commanders who treated combat as craftsmen treat their trade. They learned terrain the way hunters learn forests. They understood the vulnerabilities of enemy tanks better than the engineers who designed them. They developed an almost supernatural ability to read battles, to position their vehicles where they could kill without being killed, to exploit the split-second advantages that separated the living from the dead. But lethality was never just about numbers. Some commanders racked up enormous tallies through years of continuous combat, grinding through tank after tank in the merciless arithmetic of the Eastern Front. Others achieved their reputations through singular actions, through days when they held impossible positions or destroyed forces that should have overwhelmed them. A few combined technical mastery with an almost reckless aggression that terrified their own men as much as the enemy. What united them was effectiveness. They killed. They survived, and their presence on a battlefield could alter the course of an engagement. These were not supermen. They were products of a military system that trained them well, gave them increasingly capable machines, and then fed them into a war that consumed men and metal with equal indifference. Some died in the turrets they called home. Others lived to see their nation collapse around them. Most carried the weight of what they had done for the rest of their lives, whether they acknowledged it or not. This is their story. Not sanitized, not mythologized, but examined through the cold lens of what they actually accomplished in the most brutal armored conflict in human history. Kispel was rough, insubordinate, and possessed an almost pathological inability to play the political games that advancement required. He was also, by most popular accounts, the most effective killer the Panzerwaffe ever produced, though some historians do debate this, as some of his accounts seem to be overly ambitious. Born in Czechoslovakia to a Sudeten German family, Kispel entered the Wehrmacht in 1940 and found his calling in the confined space of a tank turret. He served first as a loader, then as a gunner in a panzer regiment of the 12th Panzer Division, positions that allowed him to develop an understanding of gunnery that bordered on the supernatural. Men who served with him described watching him engage targets at ranges that should have been impossible, making shots that required not just skill but an intuitive grasp of ballistics, movement, and probability. By the time he became a tank commander, he had already accumulated more kills than most men would achieve in their entire careers. His tally is often given in post-war accounts as well, over 120 destroyed enemy tanks, sometimes even higher, though serious historians point out that the exact numbers are impossible to verify. What is certain is that these kills accumulated across multiple theaters and years of continuous combat. He fought in the Soviet Union, where the endless tank battles of the Eastern Front provided a target-rich environment unlike anything seen in the West. He survived the catastrophic defeats of 1944, when German armored units were ground down by sheer weight of numbers. Through it all, he continued killing tanks with a consistency that suggested either remarkable skill or remarkable luck, and those who knew him insisted it was skill. Kispel later moved to Schwerpanzerabteilung 503, where he commanded Tiger tanks. The Tiger I and later the Tiger II gave him the platform his abilities deserved. A tank that could kill at distances where return fire was ineffective, with armor that could withstand hits that would destroy lesser vehicles. He used the Tiger the way a sniper uses distance, positioning himself to engage Soviet armor before it could close to effective range. His style was methodical rather than reckless, calculating rather than showy. He picked his positions, waited for targets, and killed them with the efficiency of an industrial process. But Kispel's career was defined as much by what he did not receive as by what he achieved. His superiors repeatedly recommended him for major decorations. Each time, the awards were denied or downgraded. The official reasons varied, but the truth was simpler. Kispel had no time for the pretenses the officer corps demanded. He criticized superiors openly when he thought they were wrong. He defended his men against arbitrary punishment. One post-war story which has never been 100% verified, so do take it with a pinch of salt, has him striking an SS officer who was mistreating Soviet prisoners, an action that would have earned most men a court-martial, but which in his case seems only to have left him more isolated within the military hierarchy. But again, this is debated. His final combat came in April 1945 during the desperate fighting near Urbau in German-occupied Czechoslovakia. By then, Germany was collapsing, its armies disintegrating under the combined pressure of Soviet and Western Allied advances. Kispel's battalion was committed to a defensive action that everyone understood was futile, a delay rather than a victory. On April 28th, his Tiger II was hit by Soviet fire. The specifics remain unclear, whether artillery or tank fire, but shrapnel struck his head. Kispel was badly wounded and died shortly after in a field hospital just days before the German surrender. His death came without recognition, without ceremony, and without any acknowledgement of what he had achieved. He was buried near the front, his grave effectively lost in the chaos of the post-war years. For decades, his story was forgotten outside a small circle of Panzer veterans and military historians. Only much later would researchers piece together the full scope of his service, while Czech authorities eventually located his remains, and he was reburied in a military cemetery. What made Kispel so effective was not aggression or recklessness, but a kind of cold professionalism. He understood the machine he commanded, the limitations of enemy vehicles, and the geometry of engagement ranges. He treated tank combat as a technical problem to be solved rather than a contest of courage. His high reported kill count reflects not just skill, but survival. He lived long enough and fought often enough to accumulate numbers that others never had the chance to reach. He was deadly because he was competent, because he refused to take unnecessary risks, and because he approached killing with the same mindset a craftsman brings to difficult work. The lack of recognition during his lifetime says less about his effectiveness than about a military culture that often valued presentation over results. If Kispel was, in legend, the most effective killer the Panzerwaffe produced, Michael Wittmann was its most famous. The contrast between the two men illuminates the difference between achievement and legend. Wittmann is often credited with around 135 to 138 destroyed tanks, placing him near the top of the wartime Panzer Ace lists, but his reputation far exceeded even those numbers. He became the face of German armored warfare, celebrated in propaganda, decorated lavishly, and transformed into a symbol of Panzer invincibility. Where Kispel was ignored, Wittmann was lionized. Where Kispel survived through caution and method, Wittmann cultivated a reputation for aggression. And where Kispel died in relative obscurity, Wittmann's death became a subject of debate and speculation that continues decades later. Born in Bavaria in 1914, Wittmann entered military service during a time when Germany was rapidly expanding its armed forces. He first enlisted in the German army, then joined the Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler, the premier Waffen-SS unit, beginning his career as a crew member in assault guns before transitioning to tanks. The Waffen-SS provided opportunities for rapid advancement that the regular Wehrmacht often did not, and Wittmann proved himself capable enough to rise through the ranks quickly. By 1943, he commanded a Tiger I with the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte, and it was in this role that he began accumulating the kill count that would make him famous. The Eastern Front was where Wittmann established his reputation. The massive tank battles of 1943 and 1944 gave him opportunities to engage Soviet armor in numbers that Western Front commanders could scarcely imagine. At Kursk, during the fighting around Prokhorovka, he and his crew were credited with multiple Soviet tanks and anti-tank guns destroyed in a single day's fighting. Later actions saw him continue this pattern. Quick, decisive engagements, where his Tiger's superior armor and firepower gave him advantages, he exploited ruthlessly. His style was more aggressive than the cautious school of command, more willing to press attacks and take risks that more conservative leaders avoided. But it was June 13, 1944, near the French town of Villers-Bocage, that transformed Wittmann from an accomplished tank commander into a legend. British armoured units from the 7th Armoured Division were advancing through the narrow roads of Normandy, their columns stretched out and vulnerable. Wittmann, commanding a single Tiger from SS Heavy Panzer Battalion 101, attacked. What followed was 15 minutes of systematic destruction that military analysts still study, either as an example of brilliant opportunism or of catastrophic British failures. Wittmann's Tiger emerged from concealment and began firing into the British column. In quick succession, he destroyed Cromwell tanks, half-tracks and other vehicles that had little chance to respond effectively in the confined terrain. He moved through the village itself, engaging targets at point-blank range, using buildings for cover and exploiting the chaos his initial attack had created. By the time he withdrew or was forced to abandon his Tiger, somewhere between 13 and 15 British vehicles lay wrecked, effectively stopping the British advance and buying German forces crucial time to reinforce their positions. The action made Wittmann famous not just in Germany, but internationally. The British press, searching for explanations for the debacle at Villers-Bocage, turned one German tank commander into a bogeyman. German propaganda seized on the story as proof that individual skill and courage could still overcome numerical superiority. Wittmann received the Knight's Cross with oak leaves and swords, was featured in newsreels, and became the public face of the Panzerwaffe. The propaganda machine turned him into something more than a soldier, a warrior hero who embodied the fighting spirit that Germany desperately needed its population to believe still existed. The reality was more complex. Villers-Bocage was indeed a remarkable action, but it succeeded as much because of British mistakes as German brilliance. The British column had advanced without proper reconnaissance, without infantry support, and without any serious contingency plan for encountering heavy armor. Wittmann exploited these failures with aggression and skill, but the conditions that allowed his success were created by enemy errors rather than by some supernatural genius. This does not diminish his accomplishment, but it contextualizes it. He was presented with an opportunity, and he seized it with both hands. 2 months later, Michael Wittmann died on the road south of Caen, near Saint-Aignan-de-Cramesnil in Normandy, on August 8, 1944, during the massive Allied offensive to break out from the Normandy beachhead. Wittmann's Tiger Group from Heavy SS Panzer Battalion 101 was committed to a counterattack against overwhelming Allied forces during Operation Totalize. The specifics of how Wittmann died remain disputed. British sources long claimed he was destroyed by a Sherman Firefly from the Northamptonshire Yeomanry. Canadian accounts attribute the kill to Shermans of the Sherbrooke Fusilier Regiment. Earlier theories suggested he may have been destroyed by rocket-firing Hawker Typhoons supporting the Allied advance, a view modern historians tend to discount. What is certain is that his Tiger was hit and destroyed, and Wittmann and his crew died in the explosion, the turret blown clear of the hull. Their bodies were not formally identified at the time. For decades, the exact location of their grave remained unknown, adding to the mystique that surrounded him. Only in 1983 did the German War Graves Commission locate an unmarked grave near the battlefield. Wittmann and his crew were identified and reinterred together at the Lacambe German War Cemetery. The mystery of his death, like so much else about Wittmann, became part of his legend, proof to some of his importance, to others merely an accident of wartime chaos. Wittmann was deadly because he combined technical competence with aggressive tactics and operated in circumstances that allowed those traits to shine. The Eastern Front gave him targets. The Tiger gave him a platform. His willingness to take risks that more cautious commanders avoided gave him opportunities to achieve results that made headlines. But his fame was as much a product of propaganda and myth-making as actual achievement. He was very good at what he did. He was not, despite the legend, uniquely gifted or supernaturally skilled. He was a capable tank commander who fought aggressively, achieved significant success, and died when his luck ran out. The legend that surrounded him tells us more about what Germany needed to believe in 1944 than about what Michael Wittmann actually accomplished. Some tank commanders became famous for single dramatic actions. Others accumulated kill counts through years of grinding combat. Otto Carius did both and then lived long enough to write about it, ensuring that his version of events would become the authoritative account. His memoir, published decades after the war, cemented his place in the pantheon of great tank commanders, while also revealing the mind of a man who spent years perfecting the craft of killing from inside a steel box. Carius began the war as an infantryman, but his small stature and health issues initially kept him from the Panzer arm. He persisted, eventually transferring to the Panzer troops and beginning his training on the Panzer 38T, a Czech-designed light tank that was obsolete by 1941 standards. His real career began when he transferred to heavy tank battalions, first commanding Panzer III and IV tanks, before moving to the vehicle that would define his reputation, the Tiger I, the 502nd Heavy Panzer Battalion deployed to the Leningrad front in 1943, and it was here that Carius began the work that would earn him fame. The fighting around Leningrad was brutal and attritional, a siege that ground on for years and consumed men and material with little drama and less glory. Soviet attacks came in waves, tank-heavy assaults that crashed against German defensive lines with predictable regularity. For Carius, this meant target practice on an industrial scale. He engaged Soviet tanks at ranges where German gunnery superiority and the Tiger's powerful 88mm gun made the outcomes almost predetermined. He killed T-34s, KV-1s, and lighter tanks with a systematic efficiency that accumulated numbers the way compound interest accumulates wealth. But Carius achieved his lasting fame on July 22, 1944, in a small action at Malinava in Estonia. His unit, reduced to just 3 operational Tigers, found itself facing a massive Soviet armored column advancing along a narrow road. The tactical situation was straightforward. The Tigers could not retreat without abandoning infantry positions, and the Soviet force was too large to ignore. Carius positioned his tanks in hull-down positions overlooking the road and waited for the Soviet column to advance into range. What followed was methodical slaughter. The lead Soviet vehicles, unable to deploy off the narrow road because of terrain and lacking infantry support, could only advance into the killing zone or retreat. Carius and his gunner worked through targets with the precision of men engaged in repetitive work. Tank after tank exploded or caught fire. Soviet crews, recognizing they were trapped, either attempted to flee or pressed forward, hoping to close to effective range. Neither strategy worked. By the end of the engagement, Carius claimed to have destroyed between 17 and 22 Soviet tanks in a matter of hours, though exact numbers remain disputed. He also destroyed numerous trucks and other vehicles, effectively annihilating an entire Soviet battle group. The action at Malinava made Carius a celebrated figure in Germany. He received the Knight's Cross, was featured in propaganda, and became one of the faces of the Panzerwaffe. But unlike Wittmann, whose fame was based largely on one spectacular action, Carius continued fighting and continued accumulating kills. His final tally reached somewhere between 150 and 200 destroyed armoured vehicles. Exact numbers are impossible to verify, as late-war German record-keeping collapsed and Carius's own accounts sometimes conflict with official documents. He survived the war, surrendering to American forces in May 1945. His survival was itself remarkable. Most heavy tank battalion commanders were killed or captured by war's end, victims of an attritional conflict that consumed experienced leaders with particular efficiency. Carius returned to civilian life and eventually established a successful pharmacy in Germany, living a quiet, middle-class existence that seemed almost surreally normal given his wartime activities. His memoir, published first in Germany in the 1960s and translated into English decades later, became one of the most detailed accounts of Eastern Front tank combat written by a German participant. The book is valuable as a tactical and technical document describing engagement ranges, ammunition types, mechanical failures, and the day-to-day realities of operating heavy tanks in combat. It is also revealing in what it omits. Carius writes almost entirely about the tactical level, destroying tanks, positioning vehicles, engaging targets, the strategic situation, the moral dimensions of the war, the political context in which he fought. All of this is mostly absent. He describes tank combat the way a surgeon might describe operations, with clinical detachment focused on technique rather than implications. This approach has made Carius's memoir simultaneously valuable and controversial. Military historians prize it for its technical detail. Others point out that such detachment allows Carius to write hundreds of pages about killing without ever seriously reckoning with what he was killing for. The book treats the Eastern Front as a purely military problem rather than as part of a genocidal war of annihilation. This is not unusual. Most German military memoirs follow similar patterns, but it raises questions about what it means to be good at something that existed in service of monstrous ends. Carius lived until 2015, one of the last surviving heavy tank commanders from the Eastern Front. His deadliness was a product of technical mastery, favorable equipment, and long experience. He commanded Tigers at a time when they could dominate Soviet armor, fought on terrain that favored defensive tactics, and survived long enough to refine his methods through hundreds of engagements. He was cautious rather than reckless, methodical rather than aggressive. He understood how to use terrain, how to position for maximum advantage, and how to kill efficiently. These are professional military virtues, and he possessed them in abundance. Whether that makes him admirable or simply effective is a question each person must answer for themselves. The Panther tank represented German armored fighting vehicle design at its most sophisticated. A medium tank with a gun that could kill anything on the battlefield, armor that could withstand most enemy fire, and mobility that allowed it to reposition quickly. In theory, it was the perfect balance between protection, firepower, and speed. In practice, it was mechanically unreliable, difficult to maintain, and suffered from chronic defects that plagued it throughout its service life. Ernst Barkmann became one of the Panther's most successful commanders, not despite these problems, but by learning to work around them, turning an often frustrating machine into a weapon that earned him a reputation for both skill and recklessness. Barkmann came from humble origins. Born to a farming family, he worked as a farmhand before the war. The Waffen-SS offered him opportunities the class-conscious Wehrmacht might not have, and he enlisted in 1936. He served first in reconnaissance units, fighting in the early campaigns before transitioning to tanks. By 1943, he commanded a Panther in the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich, and it was in Normandy that he would achieve the actions that defined his reputation. The Normandy campaign was a nightmare for German armored units. Allied air supremacy meant daylight movement was suicide. The Bocage country, small fields bounded by thick hedgerows, sunken roads, and stone walls, negated many of the advantages German tanks enjoyed on the Eastern Front's open terrain, and the sheer weight of Allied firepower, from artillery to naval guns to tactical aircraft, created conditions where even well-positioned defenders could be obliterated without ever seeing the enemy. In this environment, Barkmann thrived. On July 27, 1944, near the village of Le Loret, Barkmann commanded the only operational Panther left in his company. American forces had broken through German lines and were exploiting the breakthrough, armored columns advancing along roads that German intelligence had assured command were secure. Barkmann, stationed alone at a crossroads with his single tank, suddenly found himself facing an American column from the 2nd Armored Division. What happened next remains a subject of debate. Barkmann's own account claims he destroyed 9 Sherman tanks and numerous other vehicles in an engagement that lasted several hours. American records are less conclusive. They confirm significant losses at the crossroads, but dispute the numbers and attribution. What is certain is that a single German tank held up a much larger American force for a considerable period, that multiple American vehicles were destroyed, and that Barkmann survived the engagement and withdrew successfully. His tactics demonstrated the Panther's strengths and the advantages of fighting on familiar ground. He used the bocage to his advantage, moving between concealed positions and firing from ambush. The Panther's long 75mm gun could penetrate Sherman armor from distances where return fire was ineffective. Its sloped frontal armor could deflect hits that would destroy lighter tanks. Barkmann exploited these advantages ruthlessly, appearing from unexpected angles, firing and withdrawing before American gunners could effectively respond. Days later, on August 8th near Saint-Barthélemy, Barkmann again found himself commanding one of the few operational Panthers in his unit. A massive American armored column approached, and once more Barkmann positioned himself to block their advance. The engagement followed a similar pattern: ambush, rapid fire, withdrawal, repositioning. He claimed to have destroyed 15 American tanks over the course of the day, though again, exact numbers cannot be confirmed. What mattered was the effect. American units reported encountering fierce resistance from well-positioned German armor, and the advance was delayed. These actions earned Barkmann the Knight's Cross and a reputation within the Panzerwaffe, but they also illustrated the fundamental problem facing Germany by mid-1944. A single tank, no matter how well commanded, could delay but not stop an enemy advance. Barkmann's actions were tactically brilliant and operationally irrelevant. He destroyed tanks, he held positions, he survived, and the Allied advance continued regardless, because individual excellence could not compensate for strategic collapse. Barkmann survived the war, living until 2010. His longevity allowed him to participate in post-war Panzer reunions, to give interviews, and to contribute to the historical record of German armored warfare. Unlike some veterans who grew reflective or regretful about their service, Barkmann remained proud of his accomplishments. He spoke of his wartime experiences without apology, focusing on the tactical and technical aspects of combat while generally avoiding larger moral or political questions. His deadliness stemmed from a combination of aggressive tactics, technical competence, and the good fortune to command a Panther at a time and place where its advantages could be exploited. The bocage terrain of Normandy allowed him to use concealment and positioning to offset the numerical superiority of Allied forces. His willingness to engage much larger enemy forces from disadvantageous positions suggests either remarkable courage or a certain recklessness, likely both. He was effective because he understood his vehicle's capabilities, because he chose good positions, and because he possessed the nerve to fight against overwhelming odds. Whether this made him particularly deadly or simply more visible than equally skilled commanders who died before achieving similar fame is difficult to determine. By the time Johannes Bülter became a tank commander, Germany was losing the war. The vast armoured formations that had swept across France and deep into the Soviet Union were being ground down by attrition, mechanical failures, and fuel shortages. The kill counts that panzer commanders were accumulating by 1944 reflected not German superiority, but desperation. Huge numbers of engagements against overwhelming enemy forces, where survival itself was remarkable, and high kill counts were the natural result of fighting surrounded by targets. Bülter epitomized this late war dynamic, accumulating his 139 confirmed tank kills during a period when the Panzerwaffe was dying. Bülter served with the 502nd Heavy Panzer Battalion, the same unit that produced Otto Carius. He commanded Tigers, primarily the Tiger I, during the desperate fighting on the Eastern Front. The Tiger I gave him the platform to engage Soviet armor at extended ranges, with armor that could withstand most return fire and a gun that could destroy anything it could hit. While he may have commanded the massive King Tiger late in the war, the vast majority of his kills came from the Tiger I, the workhorse of German heavy tank battalions that proved both more reliable and more numerous than its successor. Most of Bülter's kills came during the desperate fighting on the Eastern Front in 1944 and 1945, as German forces attempted to slow the Soviet advance into the Reich itself. This was not the war of movement and breakthrough that characterized 1941 and 1942. This was attritional warfare in its purest form, German units positioned in defensive lines, Soviet forces attacking in massive concentrations, and the outcome predetermined by mathematics. The Soviets could afford losses, Germany could not. Each defensive success merely delayed the inevitable. In this environment, Botha distinguished himself through exactly the kind of combat that high kill counts required: static defensive positions where he could engage waves of attacking Soviet armor from carefully prepared positions. The Tiger's 88mm gun could destroy T-34s and even heavier Soviet tanks at ranges exceeding 2 kilometers. Soviet tactics, which emphasized mass and momentum over careful maneuvering, fed their tanks into these killing zones repeatedly. Botha, like other successful late-war commanders, simply needed to keep shooting until his ammunition ran out or his tank broke down. His 139 confirmed kills represent both skill and circumstance. The skill was real. Gunnery at extended ranges required technical competence, especially against moving targets. Reading the battlefield, choosing positions, coordinating with infantry and artillery, all of these required training and experience that Botha possessed. But the circumstances that allowed him to accumulate such numbers were products of Germany's deteriorating strategic position. The kill counts that might have indicated dominance in 1941 indicated desperation by 1944. Botha survived the war, but died in 1987. His accounts, preserved through interviews and documentation projects, focused on tactical and technical matters, the capabilities of different tanks, the effectiveness of various ammunition types, the challenges of operating heavy tanks in difficult terrain. Like many veterans, the broader context of what Germany was fighting for received less attention in his recollections. His deadliness was a function of timing and equipment. He commanded the Tigers during a period when those tanks faced endless targets. The Tiger I gave him capabilities that earlier Panzer commanders could only dream of: near invulnerability from frontal attack at combat ranges and firepower that could destroy anything it could hit. But these advantages came at a time when they could not influence the war's outcome. Botha could destroy 139 Soviet tanks, and the Red Army kept coming. His effectiveness was tactically impressive and strategically meaningless. This raises questions about how to evaluate deadliness itself. Is a commander who destroys 139 tanks while losing ground more or less effective than one who destroys 50 tanks while advancing? Botha's high kill count reflects both his competence and Germany's desperation. He was good at what he did. What he did mattered less with each passing month. By 1945, destroying Soviet tanks was less important than having functional tanks at all, and even the most skilled commanders could not compensate for the Panzerwaffe's material collapse. The southern and central sectors of the Eastern Front, where German forces fought across the endless steppes of Ukraine and later in the desperate battles of Normandy and Hungary, produced some of the war's most versatile tank commanders. Richard Freiherr von Rosen fought across this varied landscape, accumulating over 30 confirmed tank kills through combat that tested every aspect of tank commander competence. His service with the Schwere Panzerabteilung 503 took him from the open tank country of southern Russia to the bocage of France to the final desperate offensives in Hungary. Von Rosen came from minor aristocracy, his title Freiherr, indicating a rank roughly equivalent to Baron. This background was not uncommon among Wehrmacht and Waffen-SS officers, but von Rosen's military career was built on competence rather than connections. He joined the 503rd Heavy Panzer Battalion and served through some of the most intense armoured combat of the war, fighting in theatres where tactical conditions varied dramatically and required constant adaptation. In southern Russia, von Rosen participated in the massive tank battles around Kharkov and in the Donbass region. The fighting here was characterized by vast distances, open terrain that favored long-range gunnery, and the kind of mobile operations that German armored doctrine emphasized. Soviet forces attacked in massive concentrations, and Tiger battalions like the 503rd were committed to critical sectors where their firepower could blunt Soviet breakthroughs. Von Rosen commanded a Tiger I in this environment, engaging Soviet armor at extended ranges where German advantages in gunnery and armor protection could be fully exploited. His approach emphasized terrain selection and fire discipline. The Tiger's tactical advantages, superior gun and armor, mattered most when the vehicle could engage from positions that negated Soviet numerical superiority. Von Rosen chose positions with good fields of fire, hull-down positions that protected the Tiger's vulnerable lower hull, locations that allowed him to withdraw under cover if Soviet forces attempted to flank or overwhelm his position. This was textbook Tiger tactics, but von Rosen executed it with a consistency that kept him combat effective across multiple theaters and years of continuous fighting. The transfer to Normandy in 1944 required complete tactical adaptation. The Bocage country of northern France bore no resemblance to the open steppes of Russia. Small fields bounded by thick hedgerows, sunken roads, and stone walls created conditions where engagement ranges were measured in tens of meters rather than kilometers. Allied air superiority made daylight movement suicidal. The weight of Allied naval artillery and tactical aircraft created an environment where even well-positioned Tigers could be destroyed without ever engaging enemy armor. Von Rosen fought in defensive actions, using the terrain to ambush Allied armor advancing along narrow roads, exploiting the Panther and Tiger's advantages in close terrain while avoiding the overwhelming firepower that Allied forces could bring to bear. By late 1944 and early 1945, von Rosen found himself in Hungary, participating in the final German offensives around Lake Balaton. Operation Südwind represented Germany's last attempt at a major offensive operation, an effort to protect Hungarian oil fields and drive Soviet forces back from Budapest. The offensive failed, ground down by Soviet defenses and German fuel shortages, but it provided heavy tank commanders like von Rosen with their last opportunities for mobile warfare. He engaged Soviet armor in the open terrain around Lake Balaton, fighting in conditions that resembled the earlier Eastern Front battles, but with Soviet forces now possessing numerical superiority so overwhelming that tactical skill could only delay defeat. Unlike some panzer commanders who achieved fame through single dramatic actions, von Rosen's reputation rested on sustained effectiveness across multiple theaters. His several dozen confirmed kills came from continuous combat in Russia, France, and Hungary rather than any one exceptional day. This pattern was common among versatile heavy tank battalion commanders who served with units that operated across multiple fronts. They accumulated experience with different types of terrain, different enemies, and different tactical situations. Von Rosen survived the war and returned to civilian life. His post-war years were quiet, marked by little of the public engagement that characterized some other Panzer veterans. He gave occasional interviews to military historians, but avoided the publicity that others embraced. His aristocratic background, which might have complicated his post-war experience, given Germany's leftward political shift, appears to have created few problems. He lived into the 21st century, one of the last surviving Tiger commanders who had fought across multiple theaters. His deadliness was a product of competence applied consistently across varied tactical environments. He was not dramatically aggressive like Wittmann, nor did he accumulate the enormous numbers that Kispel and others achieved. Instead, he represented the solid, professional type of tank commander that heavy battalions needed, someone who could adapt to different theaters, who could be counted on to achieve results in Russia, France, or Hungary without requiring exceptional circumstances or taking excessive risks. His several dozen kills came from professional execution of Tiger tactics adapted to different conditions rather than innovation or recklessness. What von Rosen demonstrated was that deadliness in armored warfare required adaptability as much as pure skill. The Tiger gave him a platform with significant advantages, but those advantages meant different things in the open terrain of Russia versus the bocage of Normandy versus the mixed terrain of Hungary. His training and experience taught him which tactics worked in which conditions, and his survival across multiple theaters allowed him to apply those lessons repeatedly. The result was a combat record that spoke to professional versatility rather than exceptional genius, and in the varied combat of World War II, versatility was often more valuable than specialization. On July 8, 1943, during the Battle of Kursk, Franz Stadigger commanded a single Tiger tank in an action that would earn him immediate recognition and the Knight's Cross. The engagement illustrated both the tactical possibilities that superior equipment could create and the limitations of individual excellence in the face of strategic realities. Stadigger's performance that day became one of the most studied single tank actions of the war, dissected by analysts trying to understand how one tank could achieve such results and why such achievements ultimately mattered so little. The situation was straightforward. Stadigger found himself facing a large Soviet armored formation advancing toward German positions. Exact numbers vary by source. Soviet formations at Kursk were often understrength or overstrength depending on recent actions, but Stadigger confronted somewhere between 40 and 60 T-34 tanks with his single Tiger. The tactical problem was simple: engage and destroy enough Soviet tanks to disrupt the attack or be destroyed in the attempt. Stadigger chose good ground. He positioned his Tiger to maximize the advantages of the 88mm guns range and the thick frontal armor that could withstand hits from T-34's 76mm guns at combat distances. The Soviets, advancing in formation, presented targets that moved predictably and could not easily deploy off the line of advance. Stadigger and his gunner began engaging targets systematically, working through the Soviet formation from front to rear. The engagement lasted approximately 1 hour. During that time, Stadigger's crew destroyed between 17 and 22 Soviet tanks. Sources disagree on exact numbers, with Stadigger claiming 22 in his immediate reports. The Soviet formation broke, survivors withdrawing from the killing zone. German infantry, watching from their positions, witnessed a single Tiger accomplish what an entire panzer battalion might have struggled to achieve. The action had immediate tactical effects. The Soviet advance was stopped, German positions were preserved, and local commanders had time to reorganize their defenses. The propaganda value was obvious. Here was proof that German technological superiority and individual skill could still overcome Soviet numerical advantages. Stadigger received the Knight's Cross on July 11th, just 3 days after the action, remarkably fast even by German standards, suggesting that higher command recognized the value of the story as much as the tactical achievement. Newsreels featured the action. Newspapers described it. The narrative fit perfectly with what German audiences needed to believe: that quality could still defeat quantity, that fighting spirit mattered more than numbers. The reality was more complex. Stadigger's achievement was genuine. Destroying 17 to 22 tanks in a single engagement represented exceptional performance by any measure. But the circumstances that allowed his success were specific to that moment and that place. The Soviet formation had advanced without infantry support in terrain that favored the defender, against a weapon system they could not effectively counter at the engagement ranges Stadigger chose. Change any of these variables and the outcome would likely have been different. More significantly, the action changed nothing strategically. The Battle of Kursk continued. Soviet forces continued attacking. German forces continued taking casualties. Within days, the tactical situation that had allowed Stadigger's success was forgotten in the broader context of a massive battle that Germany was losing. His 22 destroyed tanks were replaced by the Soviet war economy within days. The Tiger that had seemed invincible required maintenance and repairs that consumed resources Germany could not easily replace. Stadigger survived Kursk and continued fighting, accumulating additional kills to reach a final total of approximately 100 confirmed tank destructions. But he never again achieved the dramatic success of that single day in July 1943. His later career was marked by the same pattern as most heavy tank battalion commanders: steady, professional work destroying enemy tanks in defensive engagements, surviving mechanical failures and enemy fire, watching the strategic situation deteriorate regardless of tactical successes. He survived the war and lived until 1995, long enough to see his action at Kursk become one of the most analyzed single tank engagements in military history. Analysts studied it for lessons about tactics, about the value of superior equipment, about the possibilities of defensive combat against numerically superior forces. Some drew conclusions about the importance of training and morale. Others focused on the specific circumstances that made the action possible. Few noted the obvious, that Stadigger's impressive victory was operationally meaningless, a bright tactical moment in the midst of a strategic catastrophe. His deadliness came from a combination of circumstances, equipment, and competence. The Tiger gave him capabilities that no earlier tank commander could have imagined. The tactical situation at Kursk presented him with an opportunity that required both skill and nerve to exploit, and his competence as a commander allowed him to achieve results that justified the propaganda machine's attention. But deadliness measured in tank kills could not alter the fundamental reality of Germany's strategic position. Stadigger could destroy 100 Soviet tanks, and it would not matter. The Soviets had more tanks. Germany, by 1943, did not. Some tank commanders built their reputations through years of accumulated kills and careful survival. Others became legendary through sheer aggression, through a willingness to lead from positions where most officers would have directed from behind. Christian Tychsen belonged to the second category, a commander whose fearlessness became both his defining characteristic and ultimately his death sentence. His combat career spanned from the Eastern Front's most brutal battles to the killing fields of Normandy, and throughout he maintained a tactical approach that terrified his own men as much as it did the enemy. Tychsen joined the SS in December 1931, making him part of the organization's early cadre rather than the wartime volunteers who flooded into Waffen-SS units after 1939. This early membership meant he was thoroughly indoctrinated into SS ideology and had years to rise through the ranks before the war began. By the time Germany invaded Poland, Tychsen was an experienced SS officer in an organization that was transforming from a political militia into a combat force that would eventually rival the Wehrmacht in size and capability. He served with the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich, one of the most effective and most notorious Waffen-SS formations. Das Reich participated in nearly every major German operation of the war, the invasions of France and the Low Countries, the drive into the Soviet Union, the desperate defensive battles as Germany's position collapsed. The division developed a reputation for combat effectiveness that was matched only by its reputation for war crimes. Tychsen was part of this organization throughout its history, rising to command positions as the division proved itself in battle after battle. His command style was unusual and revealing. Unlike most battalion and regimental commanders who directed operations from command tanks positioned behind the forward elements, Tychsen commanded from the front. His personal vehicle was a Panzer II, a light tank that by 1943 was completely obsolete as a combat vehicle, useful primarily for reconnaissance or command functions. The Panzer II numbered B11 became Tychsen's mobile command post, and he habitually positioned it not behind his formations but ahead of them, leading attacks personally rather than coordinating them from safer distances. This approach to command had tactical and psychological effects. Tactically, it meant Tychsen could assess situations directly rather than relying on radio reports from subordinates. He could identify opportunities and respond to threats faster than commanders operating from information that was always seconds or minutes out of date. Psychologically, his presence at the front inspired his men while demonstrating a leadership style that demanded they follow him into situations where death was probable. It was not cautious, it was not safe, but it was effective in ways that safer command styles were not. The Kharkov campaign in early 1943 demonstrated both Das Reich's combat capabilities and Tychsen's leadership qualities. The division participated in the German counter-offensive that recaptured Kharkov after the disaster at Stalingrad, fighting in the kind of mobile armoured warfare that German doctrine emphasized. The division's panzers destroyed 292 Soviet tanks and assault guns during the Kharkov-Belgorod operations, though this came at the cost of 77 German tanks and assault guns destroyed. These numbers illustrated the attritional nature of Eastern Front combat. Even successful operations consumed German armor at rates that could not be sustained. Tychsen commanded the 2nd Battalion of Das Reich's Panzer Regiment during this fighting, and his leadership during the severe combat earned him the Knight's Cross on March 31st, 1943. The decoration recognized not just tactical success, but the aggressive, inspirational leadership style that characterized his approach to command. He had led his battalion through some of the war's most intense armored combat and emerged with both a tactical victory and a reputation as one of Das Reich's most capable combat commanders. In November 1943, Tychsen was promoted to command the entire SS Panzer Regiment to Das Reich. This was a significant position, regimental command of one of the Waffen-SS's premier divisions, responsible for all of the division's tank forces. The regiment included many Flemish volunteers among its ranks, part of the SS's effort to recruit ethnic Germans and sympathetic volunteers from occupied territories. Tychsen now commanded not just a battalion, but the armoured striking power of an entire SS Panzer division. His command style did not change with increased responsibility. He continued leading from the front, continued exposing himself to fire that should have killed him repeatedly. The evidence of this approach was written on his body. Tychsen was severely wounded more than 9 times during his combat career. Each wound required evacuation and recovery. Each time, he returned to command and resumed the same aggressive tactics that had wounded him. This pattern suggested either remarkable courage or a certain recklessness about his own mortality, likely both. By mid-1944, Das Reich had been transferred to France to oppose the Allied invasion. The division participated in some of the most brutal fighting of the Normandy campaign, attempting to contain the Allied breakout while suffering under overwhelming air superiority and material disadvantage. The tactical environment was completely different from the Eastern Front. Allied forces employed combined arms effectively, air power made daylight movement suicidal, and the bocage terrain limited the mobile warfare that German doctrine emphasized. Tychsen adapted his tactics, but not his command style. He remained at the front, continued leading personally, continued taking risks that more cautious commanders avoided. On July 28, 1944, Christian Tychsen was killed while commanding Das Reich during the fighting in Normandy. The specific circumstances remain somewhat unclear. Different sources provide varying details. But what is certain is that his practice of commanding from forward positions finally resulted in his death. He was 32 years old, an oak leaves holder, and one of Das Reich's most respected combat leaders. He did not die immediately. Tychsen survived long enough to be captured by American forces, but his wounds proved fatal. He died in American captivity, and what happened next revealed the hatred that SS formations generated among Allied troops. American soldiers stripped his body of decorations and identification, taking them as souvenirs. This was not uncommon. SS insignia and decorations were prize trophies, but it had the effect of rendering Tychsen unidentifiable. He was buried as an unknown German soldier, one among thousands whose graves bore no names. Only in the 1970s was Tychsen's grave identified through military records and forensic investigation. His remains were exhumed and reburied with military honors, his identity finally restored decades after his death. The delay illustrated how many German soldiers, particularly SS personnel, were buried anonymously and only identified years later, if at all. Tychsen's status as a highly decorated officer made his identification a priority that ordinary soldiers never received. What made Tychsen deadly was not exceptional technical skill or record-breaking kill counts. His exact tank kills are difficult to verify, though they were substantial. His deadliness came from his leadership style, from his ability to inspire men to follow him into situations where survival seemed unlikely. He commanded from the front because he believed that was where commanders should be, and his presence there made his units more aggressive and more effective than they might have been under safer leadership. But this effectiveness came at a cost. Tychsen was wounded 9 times and ultimately killed because he refused to command from safer positions. The tactical advantages of forward command, better information, faster decision-making, inspirational leadership were purchased with his life. Whether this made him more or less effective than commanders who survived through caution is impossible to determine. He achieved significant tactical successes. He inspired fierce loyalty among his men, and he died at 32, his potential never fully realized because his command style made his death inevitable. His service with Das Reich complicates any assessment of his military effectiveness. The division committed numerous war crimes throughout its service, including massacres of civilians in France and atrocities across the Eastern Front. Whether Tychsen personally participated in or witnessed these crimes cannot be determined from available records, but his command positions meant he was part of the chain of command when they occurred. His military competence cannot be separated from the organization he served and the atrocities it committed. Tychsen represented a specific type of German tank commander, the aggressive SS leader who led from the front and inspired through personal example rather than careful planning. This style produced dramatic tactical successes and equally dramatic casualties. It created legends within the military, but got men killed at rates that careful commanders avoided. Whether the tactical advantages justified the costs is debatable. What is certain is that Christian Tychsen was deadly not just to the enemy, but to himself, and his death at 32 ended a combat career that had been built on calculated recklessness and an apparent disregard for personal safety that his men both admired and feared. Franz Baker was an unlikely armoured commander. He began his adult life not as a career officer, but as a dentist, a middle-class professional who had fought in the First World War and returned to civilian life afterwards. When the Second World War came, he re-entered service and gravitated toward tanks, eventually becoming one of the Wehrmacht's most effective fire brigade commanders on the Eastern Front. His name became attached to a temporary formation, Schweres Panzer Regiment, Baker, that would carve its way through some of the most desperate battles of 1943 to 44. Baker first made his mark with Panzer Regiment 11 of 6 Panzer Division, fighting through France, Russia, and the long retreat after Stalingrad. He understood early that the days of easy breakthroughs were over. Soviet armor was appearing in greater numbers and better models, and German tank units were increasingly forced into mobile defensive fighting rather than sweeping offensives. Bake's strength was an almost cold ability to read the battlefield and commit his tanks at exactly the point where a collapsing front could still be held together. In late 1943, he was given what amounted to a hand-picked task force, Schweres Panzer Regiment Bake, a composite regiment built from Tiger I, heavy tanks of Schwer Panzerabteilung 503, Panthers from other formations, self-propelled guns, and mechanized engineers. It was designed as a roving sledgehammer to be thrown into sectors where Soviet breakthroughs threatened to unravel the entire front. The result was a formation with enormous striking power but chronic shortages of fuel, spare parts, and rest. In January 1944, near Balabanovka and in the wider fighting southwest of Kirovograd, Baker's regiment was used to smash Soviet armored spearheads driving into the German rear. German reports credited his group with destroying hundreds of Soviet tanks in a few days of fighting, figures that modern historians treat cautiously but that still reflect the scale of the fighting and the intensity of his unit's engagements. Bach personally fought at the front, at times taking part in close-range actions where he destroyed enemy tanks with handheld weapons after his own vehicles had been disabled. Shortly afterwards, during the attempt to relieve the Cherkasy Korsun pocket, Baker's regiment was again thrown into the worst of it, battling through mud, snow, and continuous Soviet attacks to punch corridors toward the encircled German forces. His heavy tanks and Panthers were often the only things preventing Soviet exploitation when infantry formations began to crumble. The regiment's actions did not save the encircled corps, but they allowed a significant fraction of the trapped troops to escape annihilation. Bake received the swords to his Knight's Cross in February 1944 for these operations. What made Bake dangerous was not showy aggression, but a ruthlessly pragmatic way of using heavy tanks. He concentrated them at decisive points instead of sprinkling them along the line. He was willing to abandon ground if it meant preserving his armor for a more important fight a few hours later. His formations fought like a scalpel rather than a club, cutting into Soviet thrusts at their most overextended point and disrupting them before they could consolidate. In the long run, of course, none of this changed the outcome of the war. The Red Army had more men, more tanks, and more time. But on the local level, when a front was about to break and an entire corps risked encirclement, putting Bakey and his Tigers into the line could still change everything. Hyacinth Graf Strachwitz von Großzauche und Kamenetz, known simply as der Panzergraf, the Panzer Count, was the archetype of the aristocratic warrior transplanted into mechanized war. A Silesian nobleman and First World War cavalry officer, he carried old world notions of élan and personal courage into the steel and oil of panzer combat. Unlike some of the regime's political favorites, Strachwitz earned his reputation the hard way, at the front repeatedly, until his body was a map of scars. He first distinguished himself with Panzer Regiment 2 of 16 Panzer Division in the early campaigns, but it was in Russia that his legend grew. During the 1942 drive to the Don and towards Stalingrad, his battalion and then his regiment were at the head of multiple thrusts. At Kalach on the Don, German accounts credit his regiment with destroying hundreds of Soviet tanks in a 2-day battle, a figure that may be inflated but still gives a sense of the carnage. Strachwitz's tanks were among the first to wreck the Volga north of Stalingrad in August 1942, a symbolic moment the propaganda machine seized on with enthusiasm. Strachwitz's style was aggressively opportunistic. He favored deep thrusts and raid-like operations, driving his tanks far beyond the officially designated objectives to create panic in Soviet rear areas. He had a cavalryman's instinct for tempo, hitting before the enemy expected a blow and disappearing before they could respond. That meant accepting risk, driving into areas with uncertain flanks, operating with stretched communications, and sometimes being cut off. But he had a knack for sensing exactly how far he could push before the situation turned from bold to suicidal. After being badly wounded near Stalingrad and evacuated just in time, he re-emerged as commander of Panzer Regiment Grossdeutschland, leading it in the Third Battle of Kharkov and later operations. Here he turned to a different art, the counterattack on a collapsing front. His Kampfgruppen would wait until Soviet spearheads had outrun their infantry and support, then strike from the flanks and rear, breaking their cohesion and forcing them back in confusion. He turned limited forces into disproportionately effective tools by attacking Soviet columns at their most vulnerable moment, stretched, disorganized, and convinced they were already victorious. Later in the war, Strachwitz led ad hoc battle groups in the Baltic region and Silesia, including controversial operations against partisans and in support of anti-Soviet forces. His decorations, up to the Knight's Cross with oak leaves, swords, and diamonds, one of the highest combinations awarded, reflected both his tactical skill and the propaganda value of an aristocrat hero fighting for Hitler's regime. What made Strachwitz feared was the way he blended old cavalry aggression with modern armor. He treated tanks like fast, shock-delivering cavalry, not just as mobile gun platforms. That mindset produced spectacular local victories long after Germany had lost any realistic chance of winning the war. He could still ruin a Soviet cause weak. He could not save the Reich. Hermann Bix never became a household name like Wittmann, but among armor enthusiasts and Eastern Front researchers, his reputation is solid. A Panzer IV commander with 4 Panzer Division, credited in post-war compilations with around 70 to 75 destroyed enemy tanks and decorated with the Knight's Cross with oak leaves in March 1945. Bix fought where the more glamorous Tigers and Panthers were rare. For most of the war, he commanded Panzer IVs, a design that by 1943 to 44 was becoming technically outclassed by T-34-85s and heavy Soviet self-propelled guns. That forced him into a different style of fighting than the Tiger Aces. He could not simply sit at 2,000 meters and pick off targets with impunity. If he made mistakes in positioning, his tank died. At Kursk, 4th Panzer Division fought on the southern face of the salient under the Panzer Corps. Bix's battalion had to grind its way through heavily fortified Soviet defensive belts, minefields, anti-tank guns, and concealed T-34s with no heavy Tigers to soak up punishment. Surviving that taught him the brutal mathematics of modern warfare. Whoever got the first accurate shot in usually lived. He hammered this into his crews: fast target acquisition, calm gunnery, no wasted rounds, and immediate relocation after firing before enemy guns could zero in. As the war turned and 4th Panzer Division was driven back through Ukraine, Poland, and into East Prussia, Bix specialized in mobile defensive actions. His company, and later his battalion, would appear suddenly on the flanks of Soviet spearheads, hit hard, then vanish before artillery and air power could respond. To the Soviets on the receiving end, it could feel like they were being attacked by a much larger force than actually existed. In reality, it was often just a handful of well-handled Panzerpfeifers trading space for blood. His oak leaves came in 1945, when awards were being thrown around more freely, but by then, Bix had been fighting almost continuously for years. The claimed kill count matters less than the pattern. He kept surviving. He kept his vehicles running in conditions that destroyed lesser officers. He pulled his crews out of encirclements, reorganized shattered units, and went back into combat when most of his contemporaries were dead or in Soviet camps. Bix's deadliness was workmanlike rather than glamorous. He did not have the propaganda machine behind him. He did not command the biggest tanks or the most elite formations. He commanded whatever 4th Panzer Division had left. Tired crews, worn-out Panzer IVs, thin fuel stocks, and with that, he managed to keep killing tanks and delaying Soviet advances long after the war was strategically lost. If Kispel and Wittmann are the poster boys, Bix is the reality. The technically competent, exhausted professional who keeps fighting because there is nothing else left to do. Karl Nicolussi-Leck was an ethnic German from South Tyrol who volunteered for the Waffen-SS and ended the war as one of its better Panther commanders. He served with SS Panzer Regiment 5 Wiking, a formation that fought almost continuously on the Eastern Front and later in Hungary. His most famous action came in March 1944, when he led a small Panther force in the relief of Kovel, an operation that turned him into something approaching a legend among SS armor enthusiasts. By early 1944, Soviet offensives had encircled a German garrison in the town of Kovel in Volhynia. Repeated attempts to break through had failed. Nicolussi-Leck's 8th Company, equipped with Panthers, was attached to a relief group tasked with forcing a corridor to the town. On 27 March 1944, as the attack bogged down and higher command ordered offensive operations halted, he simply ignored the order. Claiming on the radio that his commander could not be reached, he pressed on toward Kovel with his Panthers. Over several days of heavy fighting in snow and mud, his company fought its way through Soviet blocking positions. German accounts credit the company with destroying around 17 Soviet tanks and numerous guns and anti-tank positions during the push. By 30 March, Nicolussi-Leck's remaining Panthers, 7 operational vehicles out of the original 16 or 17, broke into the Kovel perimeter, linking up with the besieged garrison and stiffening its defense until a broader relief succeeded. That action earned him the Knight's Cross and permanent inclusion in Waffen-SS mythology, but the wider pattern of his service is just as telling. Nicolussi-Leck spent much of 1944 to 45 in retreat actions through Poland and later in Hungary and Austria, using the Panther's excellent gun and frontal armor to wage defensive ambush warfare, long-range kills from prepared positions followed by rapid displacement. He was no romantic about the machine. He understood that the Panther was both powerful and mechanically fragile, and he pushed hard for proper maintenance and realistic planning, knowing that a dead-tracked Panther in the wrong place was just scrap metal waiting to be captured. After the war, he became involved in controversial post-war escape networks for Waffen-SS personnel, which has colored how some historians view him. But as a pure tank commander, his combat record at Kovel and elsewhere is hard to dismiss. What made him dangerous was a combination of technical skill, a willingness to bend or ignore orders when he considered them wrong, and an instinct for when a bold thrust could actually change a situation rather than just get men killed. At Kovel, that instinct paid off. In the broader course of the war, it merely slowed the collapse. Helmut Rieken is unusual among German tank commanders in that we have not just his combat record, but his own later analysis of it. A junior officer who rose to command a Panther battalion in two Panzer Division, he later became a Bundeswehr officer and wrote a detailed study of his division's wartime operations. That combination, frontline experience and post-war reflection, makes him invaluable for understanding what it actually felt like to command tanks in 1944-45. Rieken served with the 2nd Panzer Division on the Eastern Front and in Western Europe. By the time he was commanding Panthers, the division was no longer the fast, hard-hitting formation of 1940. It was a worn-down unit being shuttled from crisis to crisis. In Normandy, his battalion fought in the Bocage, a landscape that cancelled out many of the Panthers' advantages. Engagement ranges were short, flanking shots were easy to set up, and Allied artillery and fighter bombers punished any German movement by day. Rieken adapted by building a system of prepared ambush positions. Panthers would take up hold-down spots, covering likely approach routes, engage at the first opportunity, then withdraw to secondary positions before Allied artillery could react. It was exhausting, repetitive work. Dig in, wait, glimpse Shermans through hedgerows, fire a few rounds, then reverse out before the inevitable counterfire. When it worked, Allied tank units walked into kill zones and left burning wrecks behind. When it didn't, Panthers brewed up at 200 meters under a storm of HE and airburst. In December 1944, Rieken's Panthers formed part of the spearhead of 2 Panzer Division during the Ardennes offensive. For a few days, he experienced the old Panzer War again. Columns pushing through thin American lines, overrunning rear areas, racing toward the Meuse. His battalion's job was textbook: break through, roll up strong points, support infantry. But fuel shortages, blown bridges, and rapid American recovery turned the offensive into a slow grind. Rieken ended up abandoning serviceable Panthers simply because there was no fuel to move them. Once Allied fighter bombers returned in force, the offensive died, and his battalion was hammered during the retreat. Rieken was not a tank ace in the propaganda sense. His personal kill count is not plastered all over fan sites. What made him dangerous and interesting is the way he combined solid tactical command with clear-eyed understanding of what was happening around him. In his later writing, he dismantled the myth of endless German brilliance sabotaged only by Hitler. He described the chaos, the supply failures, the sheer exhaustion of crews being thrown from one emergency to the next with no time to refit or retrain. In combat, his deadliness lay in discipline, well-sighted ambushes, careful fire control, and an understanding of when to break contact rather than stand and die. He fought long after the outcome was obvious, and then he did something most of his peers never had the chance to do. He survived, thought about it, and wrote it down. Hans Christen is not a classic ace with a big disputed kill tally. He's something more structurally important, an armor officer who climbed from regimental level to Command 7. Panzer Division, the famous Ghost Division once led by Rommel. His career tracks the arc of German armored warfare. Early, lightning victories, grinding attrition, then chaotic defense and collapse. Christen served in Panzer Regiment 31, which belonged to 5th Panzer Division, and later formed part of 7th Panzer Division's lineage. He learned his trade in France and in the early stages of Operation Barbarossa, when German armour still enjoyed the initiative. These campaigns rewarded officers who could act independently, interpret mission orders flexibly, and exploit openings without asking for permission. Christen thrived in that environment. He understood that speed and shock could compensate for thin armour and limited numbers. As the war dragged on and the front stabilized into brutal attritional battles, his responsibilities grew. By the time he took over the 7th Panzer Division in 1945, the unit was a shadow of its former self, a thin scattering of tanks, assault guns, and improvised Kampfgruppen trying to slow Soviet and Western Allied advances. He was no longer leading slashing thrusts into the enemy's rear. He was organizing retreat routes, cobbling together battle groups from training units and stragglers, and deciding which villages to try to hold for 24 hours and which to abandon without a fight. There aren't many dramatic set-piece battles tied to Christen's name. His deadliness is less about individual duels and more about keeping armored formations functioning when the entire system around them was disintegrating. Under his command, 7th Panzer Division conducted delaying actions in the final months of the war, fighting on both the eastern and western fronts, trading ground for time, and trying to keep pockets of German troops from being simply rolled up and annihilated. What makes him worth including alongside the glamorous tank killers is exactly that. He shows what happened to the Panzer Force once the golden age of 1940 to 42 was gone. Officers like Christen had to turn leftover tanks, understrength companies and replacement crews into something that still looked like a division. When they got it right, Soviet spearheads were slowed, Allied infantry took higher losses, and civilians behind the lines had a few more days before the front reached them. When they failed, everything collapsed at once. Christen's story underlines the basic truth running through all of these commanders. Individual skill, whether at the gun site or on the operations map, could still produce lethal, local effects. It could not rescue Germany from a war it had already irretrievably lost. In the final months of the war, as the Red Army closed in on East Prussia and Pomerania, one Tiger II commander began carving a reputation so violent and so concentrated that even the collapsing German command structure couldn't ignore it. His name was Karl Brahms, an obscure 24-year-old SS Untersturmführer whose brief 6-week rampage around Danzig and Gotenhafen became one of the last recorded kill streaks of the entire Panzerwaffe. Brahms' path into armour had been long and brutal. Born in Schleswig-Holstein in 1920, he joined the SS before the war and served with the 6th SS Mountain Division Nord in the Arctic. There he was smashed by wounds. Machine gun fire through the hands and legs in September 1941, another wound to the lung and liver weeks later. He should never have returned to frontline service. Yet in 1943, he requalified for panzer duty and joined the SS Panzer Regiment 11 Nordland, fighting in the savage battles around Leningrad. By late 1944, he transferred into a very different unit, the Schwer SS Panzerabteilung 503, equipped with the Tiger II, the heaviest and most powerful tank Germany ever fielded. Brahms took command of the 1st Company, and in January 1945, as the Eastern Front collapsed, his company was thrown into the defense of Danzig and Gotenhafen, Germany's final evacuation ports on the Baltic. This is where his short, violent legend was made. From February 2nd to March 18th, 1945, Brahms' Tiger II Company fought almost continuously, covering refugee columns, blocking Soviet tank spearheads, and launching local counterattacks, simply to keep evacuation corridors open. The terrain around Danzig offered long fields of fire, perfect for the Tiger II's massive 88mm gun, and Brahms used every meter of it. His Tiger was struck repeatedly. He was wounded again and again, burns to the face and hands, shrapnel wounds, concussive blasts, but he refused evacuation until ordered off the line. In this brief window of time, his company's combat report for award purposes claimed a staggering total: 66 Soviet tanks destroyed, 44 anti-tank guns, and 15 trucks, a number so extreme and achieved so late in the war that OKW highlighted him by name in the Wehrmachtbericht, the official high command communique. It was one of the last times any Tiger commander would ever be mentioned. The fighting grew hopeless. By mid-March, the area around Gotenhafen was collapsing under Soviet pressure. Brahms, wounded for the 3rd time that year, was finally evacuated by ship from the Hela Peninsula to the naval hospital at Swinemünde. On the 29th of April 1945, barely a week before Germany's surrender, he received the Knight's Cross, one of the final recipients of the entire conflict. Brahms survived the war. Captured by the British on the 21st of May 1945, he spent 2 years in captivity before returning quietly to civilian life, working as a dental technician. He died in 2011, one of the last surviving Tiger II Company commanders. His record remains controversial. The numbers from Danzig cannot be perfectly reconciled with Soviet loss logs, and like all late-war German kill claims, they reflect the chaos and desperation of the final months. Yet what is certain is this: in the dying weeks of the Third Reich, when German armor was collapsing everywhere, Karl Brahms and his Tiger II Company fought one of the last significant heavy tank actions of the war, violent, short-lived, and ultimately meaningless against the scale of Soviet power. A final flash of lethality at the edge of total defeat. By the summer of 1944, Normandy had become a slaughterhouse for German armor. The narrow lanes, the hedgerows, the constant howl of Allied fighter-bombers, all of it conspired to make tank warfare almost suicidal. Yet into this inferno rolled a handful of Tiger-White heavy tanks from Schwer SS Panzerabteilung 102, among them a crew led by a 25-year-old officer candidate named Willy Fay. Fay had already seen the war at its worst. He had come from the Eastern Front, where Das Reich and other Waffen-SS divisions had been hammered by years of attrition. But nothing prepared him for the nightmare waiting on the slopes of Hill 112, a feature so contested, so drenched in blood, that British and German soldiers later called it the Little Verdun of Normandy. On the night of July 10th, 1944, Fay's battalion was ordered forward to support a massive counterattack by the 9th SS Hohenstaufen and 10th SS Frundsberg divisions. The British had seized part of Hill 112 and were trying to break south toward Esquay. If they succeeded, Caen's southern defences would collapse. The Tigers of Abteilung 102 advanced in darkness, forming a wedge of 14 heavy tanks, each one weighing 57 tons, each armed with the most feared gun of the war, the 88mm KWK-36. Below them, in the valley, burning British Shermans lit the night like furnaces, the wrecks of an earlier attempt to crack the line. Artillery roared overhead, the ground shook, and behind their Tigers, the young grenadiers of the SS crouched in their slit trenches, pinned down by British shell fire that churned the earth into mud. Fay, commanding Tiger 134, found a firing position inside a small copse of trees, the engine ticking over quietly, the smell of oil and cordite filling the turret. In his memoir, Armour Battles of the Waffen-SS, he described waiting impatiently for a chance to test our strength against theirs. He didn't have to wait long. At dawn, British armour of the 43rd Wessex Division and Churchill tanks of the 7th Royal Tank Regiment began pushing up the slope. Visibility was short, the air full of smoke, but through the Tiger's Zeiss optics, Fay saw movement, the silhouettes of Shermans rising over the ridgeline. He held his fire, waited, let them come. When the first tank crossed into the open, Fay's gunner fired. The 88mm round hit the Sherman center mass, blowing the turret completely off. Seconds later, another fireball erupted. Then a third. The British advance stalled almost instantly as tank after tank was struck by Fay's gun and the Tigers around him. But the British were not alone. Churchill crocodiles, infantry tanks, anti-tank guns, and supporting artillery saturated the ridge with fire. German infantry couldn't move under the barrage. The Tigers fought almost alone, taking hits from Piat teams, anti-tank guns, and HE rounds that slammed into their hulls like sledgehammers. Fay's tank was hit multiple times. One shell struck the turret mantle, another smashed the cupola, a Churchill shell cracked the frontal armour, showering the crew in steel fragments. But Tiger 134 stayed in the fight. For hours, the battle raged across the hilltop, an ugly, close-range slugging match where visibility rarely exceeded a few hundred meters and every hedge concealed another enemy. Fay manoeuvred his tank between tree lines, firing, reversing, flanking, firing again. One British tank battalion after another reported losses. Platoons disappeared. The advance slowed, then stopped entirely. By the end of the fighting around Hill 112, Willy Fay had claimed 8 British tanks destroyed, with several more damaged under his command. In the weeks that followed around Esquay and Molto, his tally continued to grow. His actions earned him recognition as one of the battalion's most reliable Tiger commanders, aggressive when needed, disciplined when necessary, and steady under fire in one of the most lethal environments a tank crew could face. Normandy was unforgiving. Few Tiger commanders survived long enough to build reputations. Many of Fay's contemporaries were killed or burned inside their vehicles. The overwhelming Allied numbers, the constant air attacks, and the brutal bocage turned every road into a death trap. Yet Fay survived. He fought through the retreat from Caen. He fought in the breakout battles. He lived to write about it decades later. In a war full of myths and inflated legend, the actions of Willy Fay on Hill 112 stand out precisely because they were not the usual propaganda story. They were close-range, claustrophobic, brutally realistic tank fights, the kind that defined Normandy far more than the sweeping maneuvers of the Eastern Front. Willy Fay was not the highest-scoring commander of the war. He was not a propaganda hero. But at the point where British armour pushed hardest on a hill soaked with blood and shellfire, his Tiger and his crew held the line when almost no one else could. By the final spring of 1945, the Eastern Front was no longer a battlefield. It was a collapse, a tidal wave of Soviet armour rolling toward Berlin with a fury that could no longer be stopped. The German army was broken, its divisions shattered, its supply lines gone. What remained were scattered pockets of armour, tiny islands of steel fighting for minutes, not miles. And among these last tank commanders stood a 20-year-old SS Untersturmführer named Karl Körner, leading a handful of Tiger II Königstigers from Schwere SS Panzerabteilung 503. He was one of the last real aces the war ever produced. Körner had already served as a Tiger gunner under one of Germany's most famous heavy tank commanders, Helmut Wendorf, before taking over his own King Tiger late in the war. By March 1945, he was commanding a platoon as the Soviet First Belarusian Front began its massive push toward the Oder River, smashing through what remained of Germany's defences. These were not the sweeping armoured operations of 1941. This was a death struggle, street fighting, ad hoc counterattacks, last-minute roadblocks. Körner's King Tiger was thrown into this chaos with a single task: delay the Soviets. Buy time, hold at all costs. On the 18th of April 1945, southeast of Berlin, Körner's platoon was ordered to support elements of the 11th SS Panzergrenadier Division Nordland, one of the final armoured units still capable of coherent action. The Soviets were launching their massive Berlin offensive, thousands of tanks, self-propelled guns, and infantry supported by near-constant artillery. Körner's Tigers moved into the forest of Halbe, one of the most nightmarish killing grounds of the war. The roads were jammed with refugees, broken Wehrmacht units, and wounded soldiers trying to escape encirclement. The only thing preventing a complete Soviet breakthrough was a handful of German heavy tanks, including Körner's. According to battalion paperwork and post-war testimony, Körner's 2 King Tigers took up positions behind a railway embankment and prepared for what was coming. A Soviet tank regiment advancing in column, unaware that German heavy armour still operated in the area. When the leading T-34s broke into the open, Körner opened fire. The first Soviet tanks exploded instantly, then the second, then the third. The Tiger II's 88mm KWK 43 gun, the most powerful tank gun of the war, tore through the Soviet armour at over a kilometre. In minutes, the road became a burning graveyard. Körner continued firing, shifting targets with clinical precision as the Soviet formation disintegrated in panic. Within the space of a single engagement, Körner claimed over 20 Soviet tanks destroyed, with some sources stating the number may have exceeded 30 as stragglers tried to escape the ambush. It was one of the last large-scale heavy tank actions of the entire war. But Körner's war wasn't over. As Soviet troops encircled Berlin, the remnants of Schwere SS Panzerabteilung 503 were forced back into the city limits. Körner's Tiger, too, continued fighting in Neukölln and the Tempelhof area, streets now so narrow that the 68-ton tank could barely turn. Soviet infantry swarmed from basements and upper floors, firing Panzerfausts at close range. A Tiger II could dominate an open field. But in Berlin, Körner was fighting with a giant trapped inside a cage. Still, the King Tiger's armour proved astonishingly resilient. Körner's tank survived repeated hits as he covered the withdrawal of Nordland's infantry, blasting Soviet tanks at ranges of less than 200 meters, and using the giant vehicle like a mobile fortress. By the 30th of April 1945, Körner's Tiger II was one of the last operational heavy tanks left in Berlin. The battalion was effectively gone, ammunition was almost gone, and fuel was gone entirely. The last King Tigers were abandoned and blown up by their own crews. Körner escaped the city with a small group of survivors, eventually surrendering to Western forces. He had lived through some of the worst armor fighting in human history, from the Oder to the Havel, from Halbe to Berlin, all while commanding the heaviest tank the world had ever seen. For his actions on the 18th to 20th of April 1945, Karl Körner was recommended for the Knight's Cross. Whether the award was ever formally approved is debated. German command structures were collapsing, paperwork vanished, and many late war awards remain disputed. What is certain is this: Körner's platoon fought one of the last effective Tiger II actions of the war, destroying a Soviet tank regiment in a single morning and delaying the encirclement of thousands of German soldiers and refugees in the Halbe pocket. He was one of the final tank commanders to make the Tiger II's terrifying potential a reality, and one of the last to survive it. By the summer of 1944, as the Third Reich reeled from disaster after disaster, the Tiger tank still carried an aura of invincibility. It was slow, it was heavy, it broke down constantly, but in the hands of a skilled commander, it remained the most feared armored weapon on the battlefield. Few men proved this more consistently than Paul Edgar, the Austrian-born commander who fought with heavy tank battalions on both the eastern and western fronts. Edgar served with Schwer SS Panzerabteilung 102, later redesignated 502, one of the Waffen-SS's elite heavy tank units. His career is unusual because, unlike many famous Tiger commanders who specialized on a single front, Edgar fought against the Red Army and the Western Allies, in Normandy, in the Caen sector, and later in the brutal fighting around Strasbourg and Alsace. When Edgar and his battalion arrived in Normandy in June 1944, the battlefield was already a nightmare. Allied air superiority meant that the Tigers could not move by day without attracting rocket-armed typhoons. Roads were cratered, entire villages flattened by naval artillery, and every German movement was observed by Allied spotter aircraft. For a Tiger commander, this meant only one thing: fight from concealment or die. Edgar's Tiger platoon fought in the bitter defensive battles around Caen, supporting the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend and later the 9th SS Hohenstaufen. In this claustrophobic bocage terrain, the Tiger's long-range firepower was often wasted. Engagements took place at ridiculously close ranges, 50 meters, sometimes less, with Allied tanks appearing suddenly around corners or bursting through hedgerows. One of Edgar's early Normandy engagements occurred near Eterville, where his Tiger destroyed several Shermans at point-blank range, firing as soon as gun barrels appeared through foliage. The heavy armor of the Tiger I proved its worth. Allied rounds bounced off the glacis or turret as the crew worked their gun like a factory machine. Edgar's Tiger soaked up hits that would have torn lesser tanks apart, but Normandy punished even the best crews. Many Tigers were lost to air attack, artillery, or simple immobilization, and by late July, the 102nd Heavy Battalion had been ground to pieces. Edgar survived, barely, and pulled back with the remnants during the German retreat from France. After refitting, Edgar returned to action on the Eastern Front. The Soviets now possessed vast numbers of T-34/85s IS-2 heavy tanks and self-propelled guns like the Su-100, all of them deadly. Germany's supply chains were collapsing, fuel was scarce, replacement parts almost non-existent, yet Edgar continued fighting with a consistency that made his crew one of the battalion's most reliable. He excelled in the classic Tiger style, long-range gunnery, careful positioning, and absolute patience. During defensive actions in Poland in late 1944, Edgar's Tiger engaged Soviet spearheads advancing along forest roads and river crossings. These were ambush battles where survival depended entirely on the first shot. Edgar waited for Soviet columns to enter narrow approaches, then opened fire with the Tiger's 88mm, destroying the lead vehicle and trapping the rest under fire. On several occasions he withdrew only after expending his ammunition, reversing into cover under smoke while Soviet fire hammered the landscape around him. His calm demeanour under pressure became well known, a contrast to the panic often spreading through shattered infantry formations. Edgar returned to the Western Front once more during the fighting in Alsace and the Colmar Pocket in early 1945. This was the Tiger's twilight. The once formidable heavy battalions were now a patchwork of understrength companies, running on salvage fuel and cannibalized spare parts. Crews slept in their tanks, lived in freezing forests, and fought running battles against American armor. Edgar's Tiger participated in actions around Strasbourg, where small groups of German heavy tanks attempted to delay the US Third Army. His vehicle destroyed several Shermans and tank destroyers in these engagements, though the overwhelming Allied numbers and mobility meant every victory bought only hours of time. By March 1945, the 502nd was effectively finished. Edgar's Tiger was finally knocked out after a direct hit that disabled the tracks. He escaped with his crew and continued fighting briefly with infantry elements before being captured by American forces. Fritz Langanke was not a household name among the Panzer elite. He wasn't photographed standing on a Tiger or boasting inflated kill scores, but in the chaos of Normandy, and later in the frozen forests of the Ardennes, Langanke showed the kind of armoured command that kept collapsing fronts alive, not through flair, but through endurance, nerve, and precision. Born in Gelsenkirchen in 1919, Langanke entered the Waffen-SS before the war and fought in Poland, France, and deep into the Soviet Union. By 1943, he was a Panther commander with SS Panzer Regiment 2 of the 2nd SS Panzer Division, Das Reich. His real moment came not in the east, but in the west, when the Normandy front collapsed and the Allies broke through in late July 1944. On the night of July 28th, Langanke and his Panther platoon became cut off behind enemy lines during the American advance south of St. Lo. Most would have dug in or surrendered. Langanke didn't. He took command of the chaos, gathered 3 remaining Panthers, rallied over 300 retreating infantry, and formed a breakout column, a moving pocket of tanks, trucks, self-propelled guns, and flak vehicles. Under cover of darkness, with the Allies closing in on every side, Langanke led that column through enemy-held territory. Along the route, he engaged and destroyed 13 Allied tanks, multiple anti-tank guns and transport vehicles, keeping his Panthers moving, dodging air patrols, and guiding a battered convoy back to German lines. It was not a storybook offensive, it was survival, forced through by cold steel and perfect shot placement. For that, he received the Knight's Cross on August 27, 1944. Langanke's methods weren't reckless. He used the Panther's strengths, its 75mm high-velocity gun and frontal armor, to control choke points and eliminate targets with first-shot accuracy. But he understood its limits too: the vulnerable flanks, the exposed tracks, the underpowered engine when caked with mud or shrapnel. His breakout was not a charge. It was a sequence of timed movements, forced night marches, ambushes, and rapid disengagements. After Normandy, he took over as company commander of 2nd Company during the Ardennes offensive. The terrain was worse: dense forests, mines, ambushes, but his Panthers pushed through areas like Mannheim and Grandmesnil, using night attacks and surprise to hit US armor before daylight air power returned. His company slowed the Allied counterpunch, not by brute force, but by exploiting range, positioning, and terrain. Langanke survived the war. Unlike many others, he never wrote a memoir, never inflated his record, and never chased attention. He died in 2012, largely unknown outside the archival circles of Eastern and Western Front historians. But his breakout from Normandy remains one of the most well-documented armored escape actions of the war, and proof that some of the most deadly tank commanders weren't icons, but tacticians. Georg Diers was born on June 25, 1921, in the small town of Wiefelstede in northern Germany. He grew up in a conservative, rural family, shaped by the hardships of the Weimar years. Like many boys of his generation, he entered the Scharnhorst Jugend, the youth arm of the old Stahlhelm Veterans Organization. When the Stahlhelm was absorbed by the Nazi regime after 1933, Diers automatically transitioned into the Hitler Youth, a pipeline that fed tens of thousands of teenagers into the expanding German armed forces. By 1939, at only 18, he volunteered for the Waffen-SS, joining one of the most rapidly expanding military organizations in Europe. His early training fell in line with the Waffen-SS model of the period: strict discipline, heavy ideological instruction, and harsh physical conditioning meant to forge soldiers for what Germany expected to be a long war in the East. Diers first saw major combat in the Caucasus campaign of 1941-42, when German Army Group A drove deep into the southern Soviet Union in an attempt to seize the oil fields of Grozny and Baku. Conditions were brutal: high altitude, extreme temperatures, and Soviet counterattacks that became more aggressive as the German advance stalled. In September 1942, near Grozny, Diers was severely wounded, evacuated from the front, and eventually sent to a military hospital in Vienna to recover. After months of rehabilitation, he returned to active service, this time in the Balkan Theatre, where German forces were fighting both partisan guerrillas and advancing Soviet units. In 1944, during a brief period of leave, he married, believing that the war would soon reach its end. But Diers' most defining combat experience came in 1945, during the collapse of the Eastern Front. As the Soviets tightened the ring around Berlin, Diers was transferred back into the capital with the remnants of SS tank crews and ad hoc battle groups thrown together to delay the inevitable. Berlin was already a ruin, streets cratered, civilians fleeing or hiding, and shattered formations of Volkssturm, SS, and Wehrmacht holding isolated strongpoints. During these final days, Diers served in the inner defensive zone and became one of the many officers who operated under the command structure of Joseph Goebbels, who assumed control of the city's defense after Hitler withdrew into the bunker. When Hitler committed suicide on the 30th of April 1945, chaos consumed the command hierarchy. Diers later testified that he was among those ordered to help dispose of Hitler's remains in the garden of the Berlin Chancellery, a task carried out under Soviet bombardment, with fuel scarce and shells landing close by. As Soviet forces flooded into the city center, Diers and a small group of surviving SS personnel made an attempt to break through the encirclement. They fought their way through the wreckage of central Berlin, moving from cellar to cellar, courtyard to courtyard, until the last German defensive pockets dissolved completely. Realizing that further resistance was pointless, Diers removed his uniform, disguised himself as a civilian, and slipped among the thousands of refugees heading west. He didn't get far. Soviet patrols quickly identified and arrested him. With thousands of suspected SS men in custody, Soviet tribunals carried out rapid investigations and equally rapid sentencing. According to Diers' post-war accounts, he was condemned to death, but instead of being executed, his group of prisoners was redirected to a larger transport bound for forced labor. What followed were years of captivity in the Soviet prison system. Diers was moved to Moscow, working under harsh conditions that killed many of the men transferred with him. Food was minimal, disease common, and prisoners were expected to perform heavy physical labor regardless of weather or health. Finally, in 1949, 4 years after the war, Diers was released as part of the early wave of German POW repatriations. He returned to a shattered Germany that had been divided into occupation zones and was only beginning the long process of reconstruction. Diers rebuilt his life quietly, avoiding public political involvement, though he later gave several interviews about his wartime experiences, especially the fall of Berlin, which provided researchers with additional first-hand testimony. And that brings this video to a close. I hope you found it interesting and learned something new. If you enjoyed it, please consider leaving a like and subscribing. It genuinely helps the channel grow, and I appreciate every one of you who supports the work I do here. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care, and goodbye for now.